Ba ezin hobeto, aukeraketa, gaiaren aukeraketa zergatik orain ulertuko dugu.
So, we're now going to turn our eyes to the UN. And we have a special guest to talk to us about that. So next, as an opening presentation, we have the honour of connecting up via video conference with Mr. David Boyd. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and he will be there from 2018 to 2024. Unfortunately, he can't be here in person because he's in Geneva at the moment, because he's actually, as I said, he's in Geneva at the moment. And for the first time ever, the new document is going to recognize the right to live in a clean environment. Mr. Boyd is also a professor of law, policy and sustainability at the University of British Columbia. He's also the author of 10 books and more than 100 reports and articles on environmental law and policy, human rights and constitutional law. His titles include Thirst for Justice, The Rights of Nature, The Optimistic Environmentalist, and The Environmental Rights Revolution. He lives on Pender Island in the west coast of Canada with his partner and his daughter. He loves to run, hike and kayak and ride his bike. So, first of all, we'll hear from him, and then we will be having questions.
Today, we are very pleased to have you here. You are working now in Geneva. Okay, we will see each other later in the Q&A, but in the meantime, I'll give you the floor. Thank you very much. Mr. Boyd, please open your microphone. We can't hear you properly. Thank you.
Lo siento mucho. I'm really delighted to be joining you today by video. I wish that I was there in person. It's been many years since I was in San Sebastian, but it really is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and the people are so warm and friendly that I was hoping to join you in person. But instead, today I'll tell the story by video of one of the most important human rights of the 21st century, which is the right to a healthy environment. My friends, scientists estimate that there are perhaps 100 billion planets in the Milky Way galaxy, and more beyond that in the universe. But despite the best efforts of generations of scientific geniuses, there is only one planet that we know supports life, the Earth. This beautiful blue-green planet is a miracle filled with amazing natural wonders. And yet humans, we take this planet for granted. We have inflicted cataclysmic harm upon it. When I was born, not that long ago, there were 3.2 billion people in the world. We are almost 8 billion today. During my lifetime, greenhouse gas emissions have tripled. Humanity has created a climate emergency, a biodiversity crisis, pervasive pollution, and a surge in emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin, diseases that spill over from wildlife into humans, exemplified by this terrible COVID-19 pandemic, which we are enduring. Ultimately, all human rights depend on a healthy biosphere and a safe climate. Without healthy ecosystems, which depend on biological diversity, there would be no clean air to breathe, no safe water to drink, and no nutritious food to eat. You know that a teaspoon of soil, one small teaspoon, contains billions of microorganisms, algae, bacteria, fungi, and more that feed plants and protect them from pests and pathogens. Healthy ecosystems regulate the Earth's climate, filter air and water, recycle nutrients, and mitigate the impact of natural disasters. For example, we have clear scientific evidence that coastal communities in the global south that are protected by healthy mangrove ecosystems are less likely to suffer deaths during tropical cyclones. Among the human rights that are being threatened and violated by the global environmental crisis are the rights to life, health, water, food, cultural rights, the rights of indigenous people, and the rights of children. There are 7 million premature deaths every year because of air pollution alone, a terrible statistic that includes hundreds of thousands of children under the age of 5. Contaminated water and toxic chemicals kill another 2 to 3 million people every year. For decades, governments have signed treaties and made pledges to address climate change, pollution, and the decline of biodiversity. In 1992, states signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. In retrospect, it's an embarrassing litany of bold rhetoric, timid action, and broken promises. Since 1992, natural gas use has increased 82%, oil use is up 36%, and coal use is up 68%. Overall, greenhouse gas emissions have risen more than 60%. In the 2015 Paris Agreement, nations promised to hold the increase in global average temperatures to 2 degrees at the most, while striving to keep the increase to 1.5 degrees. Yet we are already at 1.1 degrees, and we are clearly not on track to meet the Paris targets. Similarly, none of the nature-saving targets agreed on by parties to the Biodiversity Convention in 2000 were met by 2010. None of the Aichi biodiversity targets agreed to in 2010 were achieved by 2020. None of them. And so we're at a point where scientific warnings have never been more clear. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the World Health Organization are all calling for rapid, systemic, and transformative changes to human society to address the global environmental crisis. And this is where human rights enter the picture. There is a vital and promising role for human rights. If we look back at recent centuries of human evolution, we see that human rights have played a role as catalysts for societal transformations, including the abolition of slavery, progress towards equality for women, and the end of apartheid in South Africa. Rights are being used strategically and successfully by Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+ peoples, and persons with disabilities. Now, it is never easy, simple, or quick, but there can be no doubt that human rights have sparked these positive, transformative changes. And in the environmental context, human rights can help overcome what we call the Achilles heel of international environmental law, which is the absolute absence of enforcement mechanisms and the resulting lack of accountability. One example from 2019 was a decision from the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in the famous Urgenda case, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Dutch government had violated the human rights of its citizens under the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to take sufficiently ambitious action to address climate change. The court acknowledged the scientific evidence about the severity of the climate crisis and ordered the government to make faster, deeper cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. The government responded by closing a coal-fired power plant, investing billions of euros in renewable energy, putting solar panels on the roof of every school in the Netherlands, lowering speed limits, and more. And so we have this interesting convergence of human rights law and environmental law that produces accountability. Cases based on human rights are springing up all over the world where climate change is at issue. For example, the Torres Strait Islanders, a group of indigenous people, have filed a case against Australia with the UN's Human Rights Committee, arguing that Australia's terrible record on climate change violates their rights to life, health, and culture. Swedish youth Greta Thunberg and 15 other young people from across the world have filed a similar case at the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, again arguing that inadequate climate action violates their human rights. And even more powerful in the context of the planetary environmental emergency is the emergence and evolution of a new human right, the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. At the international level, this right was first mentioned in the Stockholm Declaration, a political statement that emerged from the first global summit on the environment in 1972. Portugal and Spain were actually the first countries in the world to put this right into their constitutions in 1976 and 1978. And today, this right enjoys constitutional protection in more than 100 countries. It's found in the environmental laws of more than 100 countries. It's found in regional human rights treaties, including the African Charter on Human and People's Rights from 1981, the San Salvador Protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights in 1988, the Aarhus Convention in 1998, the Arab Charter, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and this year's ECW Agreement for nations in Latin America and the Caribbean. In total, the right to a healthy environment is recognized in law by more than 80% of the UN member states, but it is not yet recognized as a universal human right by the United Nations, something that I'll come back to in a few minutes because we're working on that this week. Many people ask me, what is the right to a healthy environment? And my answer is that it's a bundle of both substantive and procedural rights. So on the substantive side, it includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play. Now, then there's procedural rights that citizens can use to achieve those substantive rights. And these procedural rights include access to information, participation in decision-making, and of course, access to justice. And the interpretation of the right to a healthy environment is guided by key principles, including non-discrimination, non-regression, precaution, and prevention. And these are critical principles because we all know that the burden of environmental degradation is not borne equally by all people. We know that people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color suffer disproportionately. Minorities, people living in poverty, and other vulnerable groups really bear a heavy burden of pollution, of climate change, and of the loss of biodiversity. The second question that people ask me is, does the right to a healthy environment really make a difference? And here, my answer is unequivocally yes. Research demonstrates that the right to a healthy environment has served as a catalyst for stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation and enforcement of those laws and policies, increased public participation in environmental decision-making, and most importantly, improved environmental conditions on the ground where people live. Research indicates that countries recognizing the right to a healthy environment have reduced air pollution faster, reduced greenhouse gas emissions faster, and provided safe drinking water to a higher share of their citizens. Let me share just a few concrete stories from around the world. Slovenia, which is a leading proponent of the right to a healthy environment, decided to get really serious about recycling and composting. In 2009, they had one of the worst records in Europe in terms of recycling, with 76% of their waste going to landfills. Through efforts over the past decade, they have gone from 76% to 7%. And Slovenia has also increased natural protected areas to more than 40% of the country. My favorite story about the right to a healthy environment comes from Costa Rica, a small middle-income nation with a really inspiring story. Costa Rica added their right to a healthy environment in their constitution in 1994. And at that time, Costa Rica had been undergoing a decades-long process of deforestation, and forest cover was less than 25% of that country. They have, since recognizing the right to a healthy environment, Costa Rica has doubled forest cover from 25% to 50%. They have increased the amount of national parks to almost 30% of the country. They generate 98% of their electricity with solar power, wind power, hydroelectric power, and geothermal power. They've passed laws that ban open pit mining and prohibit offshore oil and gas development. They use carbon taxes to pay indigenous people and farmers to conserve and restore their land. And they plan to be one of the first countries in the world to completely decarbonize their economy. So it's no surprise that at the United Nations, Costa Rica is really at the forefront of pushing for global recognition of the right to a healthy environment. France is another leader. France added the right to a healthy environment to its constitution in 2004, and that was a catalyst for the world's first national law banning hydraulic fracturing or fracking for oil and gas. France passed the world's first law that ended all uses of the bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides. And most recently, France passed a law that prohibits French companies from exporting pesticides that are not approved for use in France. France is also one of the first countries in the world to recognize in law that people have the right to breathe clean air. And again, in light of their leadership, it is not surprising that Costa Rica and France are co-chairs of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which calls for a rights-based approach to conservation and protecting 30% of the Earth's lands and waters by 2030 as part of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Croatia is another country that recognized the right to a healthy environment, and in the words of Croatia's government, quote, "This right has contributed to protecting, conserving, and restoring biodiversity by positioning nature protection at the top of the political agenda in Croatia. Croatia has protected 38% of its land." In Argentina, thanks to the right to a healthy environment, billions of dollars have been invested in cleaning and restoring the Riachuelo River watershed, which was once the most polluted watershed in South America. And this is a neighborhood in Buenos Aires that has been poor and polluted for many decades, but is now in the process of being cleaned up. In Chile, the right to a healthy environment has prompted a cleanup of a very polluted area in Quintero Puchuncavi. In Kenya, the right to a healthy environment helped to block what would have been a disastrous coal-fired power plant on the east coast of Kenya. In Mexico, the right to a healthy environment was used to overturn approval of a tourism project that would have destroyed a healthy mangrove ecosystem. And I could tell you stories from all around the world. Another of my favorites involved 25 children from Colombia who filed a lawsuit against their government about deforestation in the Amazon. In 2018, the Supreme Court of Colombia issued a globally important decision that addresses both the climate emergency and the nature crisis. The Supreme Court of Colombia said that deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon violates the right to a healthy environment of those young people. And the court ordered the government to meet with the young people and leading scientists to develop a plan to end deforestation. We're waiting for a decision from Brazil's Supreme Court about whether the Bolsonaro government is meeting its constitutional obligations to protect the right to a healthy environment. I was involved in a lawsuit in Indonesia, which was just successful 2 weeks ago, where an Indonesian court has ordered the government there to improve air quality in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. And there are really literally hundreds of examples. Last year, I presented a report to the UN Human Rights Council with over 500 good practices in the recognition and implementation of the right to a healthy environment, drawn from more than 150 countries. Another of my favorites is something called the Great Green Wall, an African project involving 21 countries in the Sahel region, south of the Sahara Desert. Billions of trees are being planted, millions of hectares of land being restored for agriculture, water capture systems being put in place, solar panels bringing electricity to the people, and the Great Green Wall of Africa will dramatically improve the lives of millions of people while restoring that region's ecological health. Unfortunately, as I said, the right to a healthy environment is not yet recognized for billions of people. 37 countries, including the United States, China, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia, do not yet recognize it. And as I mentioned, it is disappointing that this right has never been recognized at the global level. Efforts have been going on since the early 1990s to seek UN recognition of this right. And the good news is this, that there is unprecedented momentum towards United Nations recognition of this right to a healthy environment. A group of states led by Costa Rica, Fiji, the Maldives, Finland, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland recently tabled a resolution, and there have been negotiations. And what I can tell you is this resolution will be up for adoption in 2 days' time, on Friday, October the 8th. It's a potentially historic moment. It's interesting that it's happening on a Friday because of the Fridays for the Future movement. It's widely supported by 15 UN agencies, by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, over 1,300 civil society organizations have written to the Human Rights Council urging the adoption of this resolution. More than 50 of the world's leading businesses have written a statement urging adoption of this resolution. And it has never been needed so badly because of the global environmental crisis that we face. And even though they are not legally binding, these UN resolutions do make a difference. For example, in 2010, largely due to work of Spain and Germany, the UN recognized for the first time the right to water. And since then, this right has been added to constitutions in Costa Rica, Fiji, Mexico, Slovenia, Tunisia, and other countries. It's been incorporated into laws in countries from France to Colombia. And most importantly, it has sparked greater government action to deliver on the promise. In Canada, where I'm from, the recognition of the right to water by the UN has led the government to invest billions of dollars in Indigenous communities to provide safe drinking water, where those communities had suffered without safe drinking water for decades. In Colombia, the government passed a law preventing utility companies from cutting off people's water during the pandemic because they couldn't afford to pay their bills. That's a law that has saved lives. In Slovenia, the government has extended safe drinking water to informal Roma communities on the outskirts of cities. So those are all examples of how United Nations resolutions are a catalyst for important changes in people's lives. And universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment would acknowledge the reality that our lives, our health, our well-being, and our dignity depend on the health of this beautiful planet. Humans are not separate from or superior to nature, but rather intimately and intricately woven into its fabric. We share DNA with every other living thing on this planet. Nature is not just a warehouse of resources for humans to exploit, but a community to which we are remarkably fortunate to belong. So with COVID-19, humanity is paying a terrible price for ignoring scientists' warnings. We must not make the same mistake by ignoring climate scientists, biologists, and ecologists. It is not too late to respond to the global environmental crisis, but time is running out. If we fail to implement a rights-based approach to protecting nature, then future generations will live in an ecologically impoverished world, deprived of nature's critical contributions to human well-being, ravaged by increasingly frequent pandemics, and riven by deepening environmental injustices. But if we place human rights and nature at the heart of the post-pandemic recovery, then humans can achieve a just and sustainable future in which everyone has the opportunity to live happy, healthy, and fulfilling lives in harmony with nature. So I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to questions and discussion. Muchas gracias a todos. Y discúlpeme si yo hablo demasiado rápido.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boyd, for your input and knowledge. Having you with us today is a wonderful opportunity to delve deeper into the relationship between human rights and the climate crisis. We will allow the public to benefit from it. A continuación, si queréis hacer una pregunta, solo tenéis que levantar la mano.
If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hands and you will be given a mic. You can also ask questions if you're following us over the streaming channel. Go ahead.
Comenzaré yo.
Let me start with the first question, Mr. Boyd. You mentioned that on Friday something very relevant is going to be decided upon for the whole of our civilization. For the first time in history, the proposal to recognize the right to a clean and sustainable environment. What has been decided so far, and what are the benefits or the impact do you believe this recognition would have if it happened? Let's be optimistic.
Yes, let's be optimistic, but let's also be honest. There are still some countries that are not supportive of this resolution. So right now, supporters of the resolution are doing everything possible to try and get as many of the member countries of the Human Rights Council to support this resolution. So there are 47 countries that are currently members. Each of them potentially has a vote. And so, it's really a critical moment in my belief for humanity, because if we don't do this now in the face of this global environmental crisis, then when will we ever do it? Now, the time is now. And as I said during my remarks, this is not a legally binding, it's not like a legally binding treaty or convention, but it is a catalyst for change. And we desperately need stronger environmental laws and policies. We desperately need countries that add this right to their constitutions and then implement and enforce those provisions. And I gave examples of where that is happening. We need more than these isolated examples, however. We need systemic, rapid, and transformative changes. And that's what human rights have they have that potential to serve as a spark or a catalyst for those types of transformative changes in society.
Sin duda que, aunque no sea...
Of course, even if it's not legally binding, it would be a wonderful catalyzer. It would be a terrible, positive piece of news.
¿Tenemos a alguien en el público?
Are there any more questions from the floor? Yes? Go ahead.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask you, after these 20 years, after that in 1999, in a seminar on environmental law organized by UNESCO and by a group of legal and environmental experts, a declaration was passed in Biscay where the UN was urged to recognize the right to live in a clean environment as a basic right. What do you think has changed over this time?
Yes, this is a great point. There have been a number of declarations, political declarations that some countries have signed on to, like the Vizcaya Declaration that this person has mentioned. But what really has changed, I think, in the last 10 years, it has been 10 years since the United Nations Human Rights Council created a mandate on human rights and the environment to really deeply study the relationship. And, I know that one of the primary purposes of the Eskura institution is to focus on education and study these issues. So my predecessor, Professor John Knox from the United States, he did a really outstanding job of detailing the very close relationship between human rights and the environment. And of course, the evidence has never been more clear. I mean, in your introduction, you talked about the way that climate change is affecting people. I mean, in my work as the UN Special Rapporteur, I've had the privilege of witnessing that firsthand. I did my first country mission to Fiji because I wanted to visit one of these small island developing states that's really in the front of this impacts of climate change. And it was a heartbreaking journey. I mean, Fiji is a tropical paradise, but I visited the first community in the world that had to be completely relocated because of climate change. I visited 2 communities where people were living who had lost their homes in a terrible tropical storm and were now living in very difficult circumstances on the outskirts of Suva, the capital of Fiji. Very poor housing, lack of access to clean drinking water, lack of access to proper sanitation. And these informal settlements were subject to regular floods, again, exacerbated by climate change, that resulted in outbreaks of waterborne disease, including typhoid fever. So a very disturbing situation. I went on my second country visit to Norway, the very opposite. And then in Norway, I met with indigenous people whose traditional culture and whose traditional economy is based on reindeer herding. And they told me the story of how, for the first time ever, they have reindeer that are starving to death in the winter. And the reason is that they're getting rain in Norway, north of the Arctic Circle in the winter because of climate change. And these reindeer that have evolved beautifully in harmony with their environment for thousands and thousands of years, using their hoofs to scrape away the snow to access their food in the wintertime, they can't scrape away the ice. And so now the Sami indigenous people have to go out in the middle of winter, find the reindeer and feed them, something they've never had to do before. I went to Kenya and I met with pastoralists whose animals are starving to death because drought and locusts have wiped out their food supply. And so when we talk about climate change, we have to talk about the people, put a human face on this problem. You know, for too long, we talked about polar bears, and in reality, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. And I think the reason that we're on the verge of recognizing at the global level the right to a healthy environment is because the scientific evidence is just unequivocal. It is so compelling. It is so clear. You know, the evidence of air pollution. 30 years ago, we didn't know that air pollution caused heart disease. We knew that air pollution caused a range of respiratory illnesses, but now we know that air pollution is a leading cause of heart disease. And this is a huge scientific breakthrough, but it really does emphasize that we have to clean up our air quality. And the good news is that if we tackle these problems in a comprehensive fashion, we can actually address air pollution and climate change and biodiversity at the same time in ways that will, first of all, improve conditions for the most vulnerable, and second of all, improve conditions for everyone, and third, have economic benefits for society. There will be some corporations that lose out, fossil fuel companies, coal companies, oil and gas companies, but overall, those jobs will be replaced by jobs in the renewable energy industry, and all of society will be healthier, wealthier, and better off.
Sí, una pregunta allí, por favor.
Okay, there's another question over there.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be listening to you. I just wanted to ask you, given that this new human right hopefully will be recognized very soon, this will involve different, obviously, member states of the UN, but how can we actually spread this out to other stakeholders? How can we get other people involved, other stakeholders, companies, the civil society, governments, sub-state governments? How can we get them involved? How can we, for example, contribute to making this a reality, to actually have a real impact on human rights and the environment? What can we do?
Well, I think the beautiful thing about the right to a healthy environment is it's a right that makes a difference for everyone. And so we need all actors to be engaged in this. And there really are opportunities for everyone to take part. Local governments have a role to play. I mean, local governments are often responsible for things like safe drinking water, for wastewater treatment, for traffic regulation. And so local governments have a role to play. Regional governments have a role to play. National governments have a role to play. The recognition of this right will be a great benefit to civil society organizations, and that's why you have more than 1,000 organizations pushing hard to make this happen. And it is a tool for holding governments accountable. And I also want to mention the role of environmental human rights defenders. You know, people who are putting their lives often at risk in some countries to defend the land, air, water, and wildlife that all of us depend on. This United Nations resolution really says in a powerful way, we value your work. We value you as heroes for the planet, heroes for human rights. And that's really important because we're seeing around the world intimidation, harassment, violence, and in the worst cases, even the murder of environmental human rights defenders. Over 200 murders around the world every year of these courageous, heroic individuals. So it's important for them as well. And I really would encourage people to take a look at the good practices report that I prepared for the Human Rights Council last year, because it does provide examples of the way that every single actor in our society can be part of this. And I want to really emphasize as well that the greatest benefit of the recognition of this right will flow to the most vulnerable people in society. Those people who are currently living in situations of what we call environmental injustice, where there's concentrations of air pollution or very polluted water bodies. Those are the first places that should get our attention in terms of cleaning up and restoring those areas and preventing the pollution from making them any worse. And we've seen that in places. I gave the example of Argentina, for example, in Chile, for example. The right to a healthy environment has been used by civil society actors, by national human rights institutions, by indigenous peoples to push for changes that improve their quality of life. And I was just in a webinar earlier today organized by the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. Almost every country has a National Human Rights Commission or an ombudsperson or a Defensor del Pueblo. And these are really critically important players in many countries who are really engaged on issues related to human rights and the environment and have been really supportive of this UN movement towards recognition of the right to a healthy environment. So it's a tool that really everybody can use and should use.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll ask a question then. Mr. Boyd, you talked about clear evidence. And in fact, there was a warning message, about the advance of global warming and the devastating scenarios posed by the climate crisis. All of this has a theoretical basis, and there are predictions that have come true. And in fact, this year, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the 2021 Nobel Prize for Physics to 3 researchers, Suyoko Manabe, Hasselmann, and Parisi, who in one way or another have contributed to understanding this phenomenon. The recognition of the science of climate crisis comes just weeks before the start of the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference, the COP26. What does this mean at an international level? Will we be able to have another method for exerting pressure? How does this recognition change the situation?
Well, certainly the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is its strongest report yet. I mean, they say in very clear terms that the evidence of humanity's impact on the Earth's climate system is unequivocal. So there can no longer be any debate about the human causes of the climate crisis. And this evidence is very powerful in pushing governments to take more ambitious action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to protect the natural carbon sinks, the forests, the oceans that absorb carbon emissions. We also have to live up as wealthy countries. As a Canadian, I'm part of the wealthy global north. We have made a commitment to the global south to provide at least a minimum of $100 billion a year in climate finance. We made that commitment 6 years ago in Paris. We have not met that commitment, and we have to do so because, the impacts of climate change on these small island developing states. In the Caribbean, for example, a country called Dominica has been hit by 2 intense hurricanes in the last 5 years. Each of those storms damaged 90% of the buildings in Dominica. They didn't cause the problem, but they're suffering the impacts of it. And the science is completely clear that it's emissions from the global north that caused the problem. And according to the polluter pays principle, it's the global north that should pay for restoring and rebuilding after those storms. So in terms of the science, what we're seeing is there's a subfield of climate science called attribution science, and it's becoming more and more clear that we can attribute specific natural phenomena to climate change, and that opens the door for actions to compensate those who are affected by these climatic events. The last thing I want to say, we can talk about mitigation, we can talk about adaptation, but there's also another element called loss and damage. And we've been talking about loss. So mitigation, we try and prevent the problem. Adaptation, we recognize that some impacts are inevitable. And then loss and damage is a mechanism by which we support the states that are suffering inevitable impacts of the climate crisis. And you know, these small island developing states have not received a single penny for loss and damage, despite 3 years of discussions at the UN. That is a terrible failure. And so at COP26, my hope is that some of the proposals that these small island developing states are putting forward, like an international air passenger levy, where people would pay an extra $10 for every airline ticket they purchased. That may not make a difference to any of us in the global north, $10 for an airline ticket, but that would raise literally tens of billions of dollars that could be used to support small island developing states and the world's least developed countries who are really suffering the brunt of the climate crisis today.
Thank you very much. ¿Alguien quiere hacer una pregunta?
Any more questions? Oh, there is a question that has arrived on the streaming channel, and it says, it's true that there is a real impact and there are populations, vulnerable populations, which are displaced. Is there a specific program that is actually designed to try to avoid these humanitarian crises? Are there, for example, anything that's being done to prevent forecast migrations of people due to climate change in the near future?
Well, the best way to prevent climate migrants and climate refugees is to address the climate crisis by reducing emissions and by restoring carbon sinks. That's really the fundamental, the most equitable and the most effective approach we can take is prevention, and that involves mitigation. And so really the last thing that we want to do is really try and just put a Band-Aid on the problem and deal with what climate migrants today are relatively few in number. But if the scientific forecasts are accurate, that today's trickle has the potential to become a flood. And so that's why it's so critically important that wealthy nations and large polluters take immediate and radical action to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, because we have to, from a humanitarian perspective, from a human rights perspective, we have to prevent the problem and not just try and respond to it after it happens.
Thank you very much. ¿Alguna pregunta? Bueno, pues.
Any more questions? No? Okay, well then, one last question from me. How could we include impact reports in all different political plans and budgets? So how could we, in fact, integrate human rights impact assessments in different political projects and policies?
That's a really interesting question. You know, in the field of environmental law, every major project has to undergo something called an environmental impact assessment. And there are laws in every country in the world requiring these environmental impact assessments, but very few of them require a human rights impact assessment to be part of that environmental impact assessment. And I think this is part of our problem as societies, is we put something in a silo over here, we put something else in a silo over here. We have to start taking a much more integrated approach, one that reflects the integrated nature of the natural world and the integrated nature of humanity's relationship with the natural world. And so we're seeing some very promising developments in this field. For example, in the South American country of Uruguay, when they developed their climate action plan, they actually brought together the Ministry of Environment and the National Human Rights Institution and said, figure this out together. And as a result, Uruguay has a rights-based climate action plan, which is one of the best in the world. A similar situation in Kenya. In Kenya, the National Human Rights Commission there, when there's a major industrial project proposed, then the Environment Ministry does an environmental impact assessment, and then they send that to the National Human Rights Commission to assess the human rights impacts of the project. So again, getting a systemic and a holistic perspective. So I think those types of really integrated approaches are the direction that many more states need to be following. And that's why it's so important to share these good practices so that they can be emulated and replicated across the planet.
Sin duda.
Yes, I completely agree with you.
In this period in Geneva will be fruitful and successful, and the planet and human civilization need it. Y esperamos tenerle pronto aquí en Donostia.
And we do hope to see you very, very soon here in San Sebastian. We'd be very happy to have you. Thank you very much indeed.
Sería un placer. Muchas gracias.